All right, so for this critique, what I generally do is I just have three critiques. I have one that's blue and yellow, one that's red and cyan, and one that's green and magenta. But you guys were really heavily on the yellow and blue images. So it's amazing. Over half of them are in this blue and yellow category. So I'll go ahead and still do three critiques. The first one will be magenta and green with the one red and cyan, and then we'll move on to all of these images of the blue and yellow. I'll be looking at exposure. We'll talk about color, of course, and then we'll talk about light because light has a big influence on how these colors are being seen. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here with Hannah's image. And we have a green leaf, so this is obviously for green. There's no question there. She's at ISO 100, 23 millimeters, so a little bit wider. F4.5 at 1/125th of a second, so those settings all look good. The color is clear that it's green and there's no other colors. Sometimes we'll see students have competing colors, but here you have the cement surrounding the leaf and there's no other color on the cement. It's very monotone. So this is working great for your green. Now the light here is pretty flat. It's not adding any dimension to your subject. So the light here I think could be improved. And as we look at this image, you can see how soft light can work so well to add dimension. So here you have a magenta and green image, really nicely balanced. It looks like maybe you're in a tree and you've wrapped something, a scarf or something around the tree. But as the light comes in, it's soft light. So it wraps all the way around everything that it's hitting, right? But if we look here, you can see there's a highlighted side and then a darker side, right? So it creates dimension. Each one of these needles has light on one side that falls off on the other. And that creates this three-dimensional look. And you get that with the fabric as well, as the light is here and then it falls off. And it falls off on the side, right? You have this darker area and brighter area. That creates that dimension. And that's really missing from this image, but beautifully captured in this image. Here you are at ISO 200, 27 millimeters, pretty wide angle again, f4.5 at 1/60th of a second. The exposure is right on, the color is beautiful, and the light is right where we want it. So this is a great example of all of those things coming together. And also, if we look at your images, they're just really spot on as far as the colors go. A lot of students misrepresent the green or the magenta as more of a red, and you have really good representation of both of your colors. These images are by Tiffany, and here you're at ISO 200, 70 millimeters, so a longer lens. Remember, a longer lens is going to flatten out the scene. So it's going to make it look like there's less space between the edge of the spinach here and then what's back here. If you had a wider angle lens, and that's what we saw with Hannah's image here, it's going to create more space. Everything's going to seem a little bit further apart. One's not right and one's not wrong. I just want to bring that up. You're at f5.6 at 1/50th of a second. So those settings look fine as far as the balance of them, but your hard light that you're working with creates a lot of contrast in this image. So we have the really dark areas here, which is kind of the heart, the center of the image. And then we have these really bright areas where the light's hitting. If we come into the develop module, we can see there's some areas here, 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 even down here probably, that are getting blown out. So what I would recommend here is to have softer light like you have in your next image. That would allow us to move through here and see each piece of lettuce, right? Or of spinach. Opposed to here, as I'm looking at this, my eye is always going to go to round objects. This is just in general, everyone's eye is going to go to round objects and the brightest area of the scene. So I look at this image and there's these lines that are leading me to this bright white circle. So I spend most of my time there opposed to moving through the image. So if you have this hard light, maybe waiting till a different time of day to photograph this so that the window light is softer light, or you could put up like a sheer curtain or something to diffuse that light more. Here you have that softer light. So here we have light that's really illuminating all of the subject. There's no bright highlight and dark shadows, but there is still dimension. We still see the bottom of this is darker than the top of this. We still see as we get back here, these are darker and this is brighter, right? So we move through it and we still have dimension. I think a little bit more light, a little bit more dimension could work even better, but this is definitely still giving us that three-dimensional look. Your settings here are ISO 200, 70 millimeters again, f6.3 at 1/40th of a second. That 1/40th of a second would need to be on a tripod to be totally sharp if you're shooting at 70 millimeters. Remember, we always want our shutter speed to be faster than our focal length. So if you're going to hand hold, you would need to be at 1/80th of a second or faster to make sure that everything's nice and sharp. And as we look in here, we can see that we have areas of sharpness. So maybe you were on a tripod here. The focus is a little bit deeper than I would want it to be. I'd pull it out a little bit more so that instead of having this like second layer of everything in focus, we'd have this very front area. This flower would be in focus. So just setting the focal point a little bit more in front of your image, in front of the where it is currently set. Because you can see back here, this is all in perfect focus, but this starts to fall out of focus. This is a great example of magenta and green, finding it. I love seeing students put it together like we just saw with Hannah, and students going out into their yard or into their environment wherever and finding these together and noticing that pop of color that's happening. So this is a much better example of light than that first image. And as we look here, yeah, these are all pretty blown out as far as the highlights go. And then as you're moving around here with this, these different flowers, this kind of gets lost, right? There's not a focal point. So I think getting closer was smart. Yeah, either of these, that's what you turned in, right? Yeah. Either of those I think are stronger. Here, the light's not as strong as it is here. So it's not working as well. Here, the light's better. Here's the light's better. This also, I think, would work as a stronger image here. All right, this image is by Megan, and we're at ISO 100, 45 millimeters, f9 at 1/80th of a second. So those settings all look good. Your image feels underexposed here, which is a tricky exposure, right? Because you have these bright areas in the background and you don't want to lose detail there. But we want to have the best detail on your subject. And if we're thinking of where the best detail would be, it'd be about 2/3 of a stop more exposure. So you're looking at green here. You have your subject wearing green shorts, having green on the glove, having green in the background. I don't even think it's something someone would necessarily notice that there was so much green in here until you start like picking it apart a little bit. So it's a fun, more subtle approach to this green subject matter. Now, I say that this image is a little dark on exposure, but more than that, the light's pretty flat on your subject. It's not pulling him out from the background. Remember, we want our subject to kind of stand out from the background, and you can do that with aperture, or you can do that with light is always a really great way. So for this image, if you could bring in a reflector to add more light on your subject, or just move him to a place, we can see how bright it is in the background, where you could get some of that open shade to have a little bit more directional light. That would work really well also. And then here, just like we've seen in the last two examples, we have a better example of light. So here we have the light where it's creating some dimension. We can see like this is deeper and then the leaf comes up. This is higher and then the leaf goes down. We can see that dimension on each leaf. The flower also, we have some brighter areas and then the shadow or more shadow areas as you're going down, right? The top is brighter and the bottom is darker. You're at ISO 155 millimeters, f8 at 1/50th of a second. So those settings look good. I think your focus is a little bit back behind. We'd like to see this flower in the sharpest focus, and I think right about here is the sharpest focus. So you just push your focus a little bit back on this image. And that often happens because we're too close to our subject, so our camera literally can't focus as close as we want. So the camera lens is pushing that focus back, but something for you to be really aware of. So this is better light. It's still flatter light. I want you guys to really compare the difference between this light, and this light. So this is really adding the most dimension to the subject. Here we have more dimension, but and a pop of color that's really coming through. And this has the flattest of the light. So just understanding those three different categories of soft light, right? They're all soft light, but there's different ways that they're being used. And then here, lots of different images of the same thing. I think getting closer works better than here where you're further apart. The impatiens kind of get lost, right? The repetition overtakes. And then we have him in the street, and I think, again, he'd get a little bit lost here, though the light might be better on him. It looks more direct. And these crops are better as you're showing his whole legs, opposed to here where you're cropping in. I just want to make sure I'm not zoomed in. Yeah, you're cropping in on his legs. When we're here and a little bit further back, that space works nice. Or this works really well, getting nice and close. And I would shoot this as a vertical instead of a horizontal shot. All right, and then the last image that we have here is by Alicia. You're at ISO 400, 18 millimeters, f10 at 0.5 seconds. So you can see, and I know you had already told me that you weren't on a tripod for these images, but at 0.5 seconds, there's way too much movement happening here. So we're not able to focus anywhere in the image. And you do have room to adjust this. So instead of shooting this at f10, since your subject is flat, there's not depth here, you can shoot this with a much wider aperture. And I think your lens goes to 3.5. So that would be a few more stops of light that you could get from your aperture just by opening it at 3.5 instead of 10. And then that would allow you to have a faster shutter speed. And you would want a fast enough shutter speed to hand hold. So you might have to bring your ISO up as well. And then here, same thing. There's a lot of movement happening here. Here you were at 0.5 seconds. Here you're at a fifth of a second, so a faster shutter speed. And we have that same object. Remember, these need to be two different scenes, two different objects. But at 1/5 of a second, we still see that movement. So you need to get on a tripod. I know that wasn't working for you, but in order to have sharp images, we need you to open up your aperture, raise your ISO, or get on a tripod here, because we can't have this much motion blur in our images. The light for both of these looks like it's just indoor light, like overhead light. So photographing this near a window would work better, or taking it outside would work better. So you had more light instead of shooting in this darker area where you had to have a longer shutter speed. And now looking at your different images, even here where you're photographing the bracelet on the shirt, this works better because it's two different objects then. And you have this band, TheraBand, like for physical therapy kind of exercises. So we can see this, but if you could abstract it a little bit, like when you have it here and you're looking at this shirt and it's all tangled up, getting close so we're not seeing the carpet around, we're just seeing these two bands kind of together, the band of the shirt and the TheraBand mixed together, and have that abstraction, almost like we saw here. That could work a lot better as far as being more creative with your approach to this.